Hey, thanks so much. I'm Francesca Gavin. I'll be chairing the conversation today. Do you want to each introduce yourself so we know who is who?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Let's go in alphabetical order. Holly.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name's Holly Stevenson.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure if I was next. My name's Lindsey MENDICK.
Hi, I'm Shary BOYLE. I'm coming from Toronto.
Brilliant. So obviously you're all in this incredible group show online at the moment. And I want to ask you all a little bit about how you first became attracted to the medium. I know that many of you have worked in other mediums outside of ceramics as well as it, but I'm very curious to see about like what led you into the medium. Shall we begin with you, Lindsey?
Oh. I think it was after my BA. I started very early with sort of air drying clay because I didn't really have access to ceramics or understand the process of ceramics at all. So I started after my BA in air drying clay because I found it a medium that kind of quite instantly took on the ideas that I was having, so that like it really responded well to my touch, and that from like quite a like malleable lump became something that was like something that was straight from my imagination. And to me, that was something, its responsiveness and the quickness of my ideas and the fluidity of it was something that really, I don't know, appealed to me.
Yeah. And you, Shary, I mean, obviously you also work with such a variety of mediums like collage and drawing and animation and performance work. Yeah, I'm really curious how ceramics began to be so much part of what you do.
I do, and Lindsey said it really well, because I had a very similar experience coming out of drawing and painting, that I started to work with kind of a synthetic modeling compound, which was easily accessible in any kind of hobby store or craft, like art supply store, because without the training, if I had no formal training in ceramics or sculpture, I had to just start to kind of move around in the dark to find a sculptural material that was really fast. So in a way, it becomes a sketching device with, you know, because proper ceramics, once you get into the medium deeply, that's the opposite. You know, you always have that fast work in clay, but really it becomes, you can make it as time consuming and laborious a process as you want it to be once you get the skills. But earlier, just having a fast kind of plastic medium to start to work out three-dimensional ideas. I feel like moving from two-dimensional image realm, which is something that is very interior when you're making a drawing, I feel like you lose yourself in another world and you're not really embodied at all because your surface is flat and you're just trying to translate your imagination on a flat plane. Once I started to experiment with clay early, then I saw that I was in my body more, and I was actually physically interested in being in my own hands and arms, and, you know, especially because I'm making figurative work. And then my training in clay came around through, because I'm really interested in alternative models of learning outside of institutions. So I look to apprenticeship and workshops and hobby craft kind of internships, or whoever has kind of interesting material skills. I'm also interested in the social aspect of that. So I found some women in their 80s that do basement ceramic classes that I started to basically integrate to their shock and amazement. Did you do that? There you go. So did they love you? Were they like fresh blood?
Yeah, it was just like one of those sorts of mini like hobby places, and like I'd go every week and then I made sort of like really terrible dishes to start with, but like that process of seeing something come out of the kiln was just, it's really orgasmic, and it's like this thing that you get completely enamored by and hooked into, and then suddenly you're in this horrible sort of process where things come out really well or make you just really depressed.
Yeah, there is always that tension.
Interesting is alchemy, right? Did a similar kind of background process?
Totally similar. I'd always been obsessed with papier-mâché from a very young age. So, for example, my mother, I wanted a tortoise and they wouldn't quite rightly let me have one. So I made tortoises. And then my degree show was all about paper and pulping paper, but I'd also worked with lard, I'd worked with jelly. And one day at the school gates, I was looking very depressed, and a friend of mine who trained trained ceramicist from the Royal College. She said, you know what you need to do? You need to come to my adult education class and sort your life out. And the minute I put my hand in that clay, that was it. Because clay is like skin and it solidifies touch. I remember reading that, somebody clever had explained it in that way. And it is, I think, working with ceramics is a metaphor for the body. Naturally, you know, you've got to continually stop this thing from cracking up, and you've got to like mold it and move it, and just, yeah, clay, I just fell in love from the minute I got my hands on the stuff. That was it, I was off. And I think I work as an artist very much in projects, and I think the clay project for me is a life work, really.
I mean, it's really interesting having the way that you all talk about this kind of physical bodiliness, this tactility in the material, because it goes so well with the thematic of the work on show here, which is very much about the physicality of human body parts, or like this kind of sort of genitalia-like figures, or like this kind of eroticism within the physicality. Do you want to tell me about what you found interesting about that kind of the reflection of the body in terms of content, as well as your own tactility of playing with the material?
I think because ceramics is like such a bodily process, like we were talking just slightly before we started recording, but I quite often see all of the things that I make, because I make ceramics usually as part of larger installations. So to me, ceramics are usually protagonists, and they are these sorts of extensions of myself, or extensions of the body. Like they are kind of holding the narrative of the whole show and creating a more emotional and personal effect. So it's kind of like the gritty storylines, or like the soapy sort of storylines, are all within these sorts of unfurling and kind of quite leaky, quite grotesque ceramics that are kind of more a representation of how I feel inside my body, rather than to how I look externally, if that makes sense. So I think with a lot of women, or well, I don't, actually probably with a lot of people in general, they have these sorts of relationships with their bodies where they often feel quite polar with them. And, you know, like with ceramics, I'm able to create these sorts of extensions that are creating like physical manifestations of this feeling that I have. So I quite enjoy them being these quite grotesque and scary extensions, sort of, you know, like showing my inner psyche. Oh my God, that looks terrible of what's on show. God.
What's so interesting looking at Shary and Holly's work, which it feels much more like sensuous in a way, or like kind of erotic even, whereas yes, there is something very grotesque about the kind of lumpy brown, but also the glaze. The glaze you use with like these little eyes coming out is also very kind of inviting. So as much as there's horror there, there's also like a attraction.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the ceramic process is so seductive, like, so there's the juxtaposition of the content of what you're creating, and then with these gorgeous, like enticing glazes. So like they're completely at odds, sort of at odds with itself. But to me, that's always quite an interesting paradox to have within an exhibition, something that's talking about something that's quite, I don't know, off-putting, but then alluring you at the same time because of the seductiveness of ceramics as a medium, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in contrast, Shary, your work has, like, the pieces you have on show here are almost closer to something like figurines, or like that kind of almost like, I'm thinking mice in China from, you know, German 18th century or something, like this kind of sort of like playfully genderless very much in your case, but also playing with a lot of those kind of that historical references. Yeah, do you want to tell me a little bit about like the representation of the body with what you're doing with that?
Well, like Lindsey said, there's that tension, I think, inherent in ceramics. For me, going into porcelain as my first clay, and not being trained in glazes at all, but I studied in Meissen. I went to look at that 18th century and work of Johann Candler, which is my favorite modeler of that time in the 1700s. He was doing figurative work at Meissen. And the China painting, so the kind of old grinding of the pigments into the clove oils, was still being practiced, is still being practiced all over the world, but I learned it there. They have workshops, so I could learn the fundamentals. So that kind of combination of, you know, exquisite detail that is very much tactile and like gloss, like clear glazes, like viscera, right? It's like sweat, or it's like spit. It has a really sexual and kind of bodily gloss on the skin, you know. So I think people are really evoked by that when they see it. But the porcelain is also so fragile, but it's also vitrified. You know, you're putting it through this really, really high fire of transformation, of alchemy. So you have this extraordinary thing that's so strong at the end, yet it's also so fragile. And if you smash it against a wall, which I've done many times out of sheer, like, the joy of breaking something, because you can get like overly concerned with the kind of preciousness of it. So I love that tension between the kind of inner and outer, and the fragile and the strength of the medium. So these works that I'm showing at Saltoun are very much selected to kind of create a little trio that have relationships with each other. I've experimented in a fairly broad range of languages, but definitely coming out of a figurine tradition because of the being so moved by the incredible skill of those historical sculptors that worked in the medium. As anybody knows that sculpts with porcelain, in particular clay, it's a very difficult clay to do handwork in. It's much easier to make molds and pour it to make really fine detail, but porcelain can get really crumbly or, you know, sticky. It's like a difficult thing. So working with that first, it kind of trained me in a way that I have a lot of respect for the medium. But I think, you know, endlessly talking about how it's like skin or body just shows you how much we're in relationship with the material and how much love there is for the material. Like, it is kind of a part of ourselves in a way, but I also have often thought of it as another. So it's not only like the visible self, but it's also like I can feel in relationship, especially when my scale goes up. You know, there's a lot of stroking going on. You know, a lot of smoothing and stuff, you know, like it's kind of, you're getting to do things with a body that real bodies actually either don't allow you to do them, or you break them, or you know, rupture them.
I mean, Holly, looking at the pieces you've brought together here, they're also a really interesting kind of different approach to it, because they are like physical elements in there, but there's also a lot of kind of decorative elements in them, and they kind of seem, yeah.
Well, I relate very much to what Shary and Lindsey are both saying, but yeah, I was also trained by a German ceramicist who was a specialist in porcelain, but I couldn't handle the stickiness of porcelain. It did something to me. We just were never going to go out together. And I actually use, sorry, Shary, it's all yours.
You can have it.
And I use an English clay that was invented by the English, because the Chinese, they couldn't work out at that point how to make porcelain. So I use an English ball clay that has a different plasticity, but again will allow me to do all that stroking and molding and maneuvering. And I mean, for me, ceramics really took off when I got very into psychoanalysis, and when I went through that process myself. And my ceramic project invariably goes back to Sigmund Freud's ashtray, where I take these two forms from his favorite ashtray, this sort of ovular kind of very feminine shape, could be a womb, could be an eye, could be a breast, could be a, and then you know, the cylindrical phallic shape of the cigar. And I sort of continued to play with these forms and shape them up into bodies that begin then to speak for themselves. And I think, back to your question, the decoration comes in my work, because I think it's so interesting how you can make something so abstract, yet the minute it's articulated with a bow or with something jewelry like that, it automatically, you know, connotes the feminine. It talks about what a woman may or may not be. And then that also goes back to the interest. I think this relates to all our work. You know, can't get away from those cabinets in the V&A and how women have been perceived through the figurine. I mean, what are all those busty milkmaids about?
Me.
Lindsey, you know what? You'd make a fabulous plastic milkmaid.
I know. I really do. I really do.
Okay, got to work on that.
My dream.
Well, coming off that, what's also interesting, Holly, is also like the approach to scale. And I'm actually really curious where you all think about that. I mean, for me, I totally relate to what you mean about those kind of little tchotchkes, which my grandmother used to fill in your face, like, and collect, which you still see at hundreds of junk shops. And I think they basically defined the grandmother. But I'm really curious what, like, because a lot of your things feel quite small. And yeah, I'm just very curious how all of you find interesting about the intimacy or playing around with different sides of scale with that material.
I'll start. I'm quite restricted to whatever kiln I've got. So, I mean, like, I would love to be able to sit there and just be like, have a long conversation about cuteness and the miniature and, you know, like all of these sorts of things. But like, ceramics dictates to you, well, I sort of believe this, especially if you're a younger artist, and cost is part of the equation. So ceramics have always dictated to me on what access I have to a kiln of how big they'll be. But also there's this thing about having smaller items, the loss is a lot easier to deal with. So recently I've been coiling quite large pots, and you know, like, it's so long that goes into making them just so smooth, and exactly how you're saying, caressing them, you know, talking to them, saying, you're beautiful, aren't you? You know, like, just like, oh, you've done very well. And then when they break, there's like it's quite tangibly quite different to something that's smaller. I mean, even with the detail and stuff, like, for me, it's like, oh, I can't do that number of hours. So there's a woman just down the road called Abigail, and she has the biggest kiln I've ever seen. And I just couldn't actually imagine making anything that wasn't kind of in relation to my size or the body. Because I feel like there's something that goes, that sort of craft side that you were talking about with the miniatures. I think there's something that's quite lovely to kind of stay within the language of that. Like, I'm not looking too much to like get bigger than that. And I don't think that if I was, ceramics would be the medium that I'd use. I mean, I'm not sure if all of you are artists who use different mediums, but like, ceramics for me lends itself quite well to the tabletop sort of personal, and it's kind of something that I can do without the help of anyone else, if that makes sense. And it's mine and I own it. But as soon as I was to go bigger or much bigger, it's kind of like, that's when I can't quite carry it. And like, now I can carry it like my babies and carry them to the kiln. But the moment that I'm relying upon someone else, then I feel like I'll be losing this like this sort of sense that I have total control with this object. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. so many rich things that you just said. And it's funny too that we talk about control in the same breath as like complete lack of control as soon as you put it on home, right? So again, that kind of tension and duality about it. Yeah, there's so much to be said about that figurine. I think that it haunts all of our dreams, you know, as women in particular. And it's also a belittlement and a kind of, there's a relationship to scale that I think women artists have often struggled with, because I'll just speak for myself. The masculine thing about massive scale, architectural scale, Richard Serra scale has, you know, I kind of grew up being really force-fed this idea that that was important, and that if you weren't working to that scale, you weren't ambitious and you weren't actually serious. And there was always this absolute rejection that I felt inside that was very kind of punk of don't tell me what scale is absolutely crucial, because I am working in an internal scale, you know, and I want you not to stand back from me. I want you to get closer, because it's really easy to put on a masquerade when you're far away from something and you can posture and have mannerism. But when you're very close to me and you're looking at something very detailed, I'm really asking you to look inside of yourself and look back up at me so I can see your eyes. I want that type of intimate connection. I want that honesty and that kind of vulnerability. And I feel like scale really pulls people in that way. And it absolutely denies the narrative of, you know, a very masculine kind of aggressive use of insisting on importance. yeah, I think about all the narratives that we've built, the heroic narratives in our various cultures, European cultures, that are so based on this idea of the monumental and the kind of hero. And I'm looking more at, there's this, Ursula Le Guin, science fiction writer, who talks about the carrier bag of fiction, where, or the carrier bag theory of fiction, where she disputes the idea of the heroic and the kind of aggressive, and instead turns to the vessel as really, can we look back through history and look at what kind of vessels we have created to carry things, whether they're seeds, food, children, clothing, work, nomadic lifestyles. It's always been based on this idea of the carrier, the hunter, like the gatherer, And I love that very much, and how it relates to the vessels and how it relates to scale and ceramics. But the notion of what these figurines mean to people, I mean, I was embedded with the women who deeply integrated that narrative into their lives. When I was in those hobby groups for years, wherever I was living, I'd seek them out and kind of join them to have the conversations with the elderly generation, almost conversations I wouldn't have in my own family, but I could have them with these strangers, because it was really about these narratives that I've found quite violent, in a way, but and I wasn't going in there in an angry way, but just in a real curiosity, like what is your relationship to that milkmaid, or that princess, or that romantic heroine with this body, this impossible body, and this like in endless youth and seductive kind of role, right? Because these were elderly ladies who had kind of devoted their lives to that story, and I just wanted to know what was coming out of it in the end, like what and what was being passed on, like how could I benefit or value this at all. So I ended up completely messing with those molds, right? And to spark the conversation. And it was amazing. We had like a really kind of opening and educational time together.
I mean, Holly, you definitely are also playing with a lot of those ideas there's like such a brilliant overlap.
Oh, there's so much. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's so much in that, but so scale. If you think about the biggest probably ceramic work ever made is Niki de Zonfal, the Tarot Garden, and what does she ask you to do? She asks you to go inside her. Mm. So, and ceramics don't scale up unless somebody works with mosaic. They don't, they crack up outside. So ceramics are domestic, they're naturally domestic, and the vessel, ceramics always at some point have to return to the idea of the vessel, that's how they work. And that's very much in my process. All my ceramics are vessels. There is some vessel element, unless I make bouquets. And again, that's going back to the idea of subversion. So taking something that's traditionally been acknowledged as beautiful and then subverting it, in trying to understand why as humans I mean, for millennia, we've kept small ceramic Venuses in our houses, or these tiny things that are made from clay that somehow they're votive, or they mean, so ceramics are all about touch. And that thing about being limited to a certain size, I think, because we are trained to acknowledge, big Western male art, but actually once, I too became very at home with the idea of working on this intimate scale, and I can't really see it any other way now. I like being that close to a material. I can't imagine scaling up. And then what would happen? Would I work with fiberglass? Would I work with some toxic product? I mean,
you can really see, there's this woman around the corner from me in Margate, and her pieces and her are just absolutely massive. It's using but I suppose it's using ceramics more in a sort of brickwork sort of coiling sort of technique, and it's not immediate, it's slow as anything, it's drying out the whole thing in levels. I mean, I'm not a ceramicist, so I flat out, I am an artist who works with clay. I don't know a lot about it in that sort of respect, but watching her and using it to make these absolutely massive, bulbous columns that are taller than me. There's two different ways, but with every material, there's different ways to use them. But I think when you are sort of creating narrative within them, it does lend itself to that tabletop size, doesn't it? Like, rather than being these sort of big, bulbous sort of quite masculine sort of structures without like that sort of storytelling within them, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsey, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's something that seems very prevalent for, let's say, the wave of reinterest in ceramics in recent years, which is, again, most people coming not necessarily from, like, let's say, craftsmen, but much more from a wider conceptual art background. And I'm really curious about your feelings about, like, the misuse of technique, or like pushing the boundaries within a genre, because I think you all do that in really interesting ways. Like, you're aware of what it's supposed to be, but whatever you're producing is not the thing. It doesn't. In fact, in fact, it seems like all your work seems to be in different ways trying to do the exact opposite of the restrictions within the genre.
Yeah, I think so. I've done quite a lot of exhibitions with community groups and complete novices to clay, and sometimes the things that they do is just so much less restricted to the things that I do. Like, I'm looking for that surface, or I'm looking for it to evoke this thing, and then someone does this dog hugging a person, I'm like, oh my god, like that's said so much more than I could. And it's not, and like ceramics actually is probably as well with painting, because I'm trying to paint for my next show. And so I asked Rhiannon Salisbury, who is an amazing painter, but to teach me, or just the basics, just the first things. And she's like, you use 3 colors to paint. I was like, what, really? Because I've got this whole set, like, do you know what I mean? And like, you use 3 colors? No one told me that. Thank you for letting me in. But like, there's this thing with ceramics, like it takes one person to sort of let you in and to tell you some things, like, don't put a block this big in the kiln, it will explode. And like, when you know that first bit of that, they need to be hollow, the world's your oyster. And I'm not looking to be an incredible ceramicist, because I can see what they're doing. I tried throwing classes with my friend Frankie, and she does this amazing like crockery, and I can't do that. I don't have the patience for it. It's not what I want it for. And that's amazing, but I'm not there. I'm not interested. I mean, I'm interested in glazes in terms of the surface, but I don't want to mix them. I don't want to spend 700 years trying to find the perfect blue. Like, that's not why I came to it as a medium. So I think for me, I'm maybe subverting it in terms of what a ceramicist would do, but in terms of how an artist approaches a medium, which is just get stuck in and then play with it, do loads of shit wrong, then come out with something that's like kind of you and of how you want it to be. That's how I feel like ceramics work well for me. I hope that's answered it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Shary, feelings about
interesting, because again, like, it's kind of the immediacy, what you're talking about, that was so satisfying, that brought you there in the first place. Because there is a tension, I think, with those of us that come out of a contemporary art background and discover ceramics later on, as opposed to being trained from the very beginning within the ceramics medium. Because I know many trained ceramic artists that have a really deep sense of history and craft, knowledge of the material, like what you're saying, that goes so far beyond anything that I went into that as a,
you kind of trample it as an artist, like you trample that and say, oh, I'm a ceramicist. It's like,
yeah, I know there's a lot of things we're talking about here, because there's also been a lot of status between craft and fine art that's been really there's there can be people either looking down on it, or people feeling upset that their traditions are not being honored. So you're working within kind of a charged medium. I definitely came in as a sculptor using clay, and friends that have been, doing some of the most complicated technical work in ceramics that you really need to devote 10, 15 years into practice and learning. Seeing someone be really fast and sloppy with glaze or clay and throw it in the kiln and great, good enough, and then get some show somewhere, they're really pissed, right?
Yeah.
They're like, hold on a second, it doesn't work like that. I mean, I've had it was interesting, because there's also like that purism of the form is what it kind of, I'm not interested in that either. And I also see kind of status and power in it that makes me feel uncomfortable, because I really want people to be able to approach any material as a human being and look for their creative expression. And clay is so much like that. Like people from any walk of life can find something in it and do fast and quick, like satisfying results of expression. And that's very beautiful. But then you also, I had the honor of watching Korean traditional ceramic artists at Gyeonggi International Ceramic Biennale that happens every 2 years. And in 2017, I exhibited my work there. And, you know, people were working with traditions that were maybe 1,000 years old, taking clay that they're making themselves, and in such a mass quantity that you can't even wedge it by hand. You have to put it on the ground and wedge it with your feet. So there's all these men like dancing on these mass clay, and with their bare feet, and their feet are going into it. It's so beautiful. It's so incredible. I did so many amazing videos. And then 2 people rolling coils that were like this wide to make pots, coiled pots that you could put 3 people inside, and they're making it outside. So you're talking about climate too, because there's certain climates like Nikki Vincent doing her things in the south of France or whatever, or in Barcelona where you're seeing architectural ceramics of Gaudi. These are climates not like Canada where you're going 40 below and 40 above, you know, like every year it just would explode, right? So yeah, it's an interesting field. Like people think that it's a simple craft, you know, that is just something to pot around with, you know, there's a real discrimination with the feminine relationship to it. And I've also studied that economically, where, for instance, figurines were originally just the domain of male artisans that were being sold to the monarchy in Europe for gold. Right. And then as they slowly became mass produced and tchotchkes, now it's just women working for 5 cents an hour, you know, hand painting in factories, and they're very devalued as a tchotchke. Right. But, you know, you see the gender relationship to that historical process as well.
Yeah, Holly, just to finish, because your misuse is like really self-evident. There's a lot of skew. I mean, it's great. There's a skew wiffness. A lot of things are like intentionally like physically misused.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my work is very much about balance, and therefore is very sculptural. I mean, trying to make a figure stand on a pot is quite difficult. Funnily enough, I live by Henry Moore's Woman Standing on a Knife Edge. That's not actually the title. I think it's Figure on an Edge, but really that's what it is. Well, my background's art history, and it was very boring. And it wasn't until Professor Deborah Strickland walked in the room, this diminutive woman, and who started speaking about monsters, women, and Jews, that I realized that, you know, it wasn't all about the Dia Foundation and cleaning up after men. And, you know, ceramics, there is that camp that all they talk about is Bernard Leach and how to glaze something at, you know, 12 million degrees. But I avoid that. The minute I hear those conversations, I just shut down. And I have great respect for making moon pots and all of those traditions. But the conversation I think I'm having with clay is somewhat different, and I'm using it because I want to, you know, not because I want to enter into a grand tradition. And yeah, I don't really know like how I could explain it better, really.
You don't have to. I'm going to say that's our conversation. Thank you all very much for chatting. That was really fun.
Yeah, I feel so much better seeing humans and talking about art rather than being on my own in a studio.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's such a rich conversation.